The ocean was supposed to be the safest place left. Far from trenches and artillery, far from the front lines that scarred maps and headlines, the sea still felt neutral, open, predictable, governed by rules that had existed for centuries. A passenger ship moved steadily across the Atlantic, its lights visible against the dark water, its decks filled with civilians who believed reasonably that distance still mattered. That neutrality still meant something. That war, brutal as it was, remained contained to soldiers and borders. Below the surface, a submarine rose slowly. Inside its steel hull, the air was stale and heavy, thick with oil and sweat and recycled breath. A commander leaned into a periscope, adjusting the angle just enough to bring the ship above into focus. He could see the silhouette clearly now. He could make out the flags, the shape of the hull, the speed. There was no shouting, no exchange of fire, no warning shots, just calculation. Was the ship carrying weapons? Was it transporting supplies? Was it truly civilian or merely labeled that way? The rules said one thing. The reality of this war said another. The ocean was quiet, almost peaceful. Then the decision was made. A single torpedo slipped into the water, invisible once it left the tube. There was no battle in the traditional sense, no charge, no defense, no retreat. Only a moment, stretched thin between launch and impact. When the explosion came, it shattered more than steel. It shattered assumptions about safety, about distance, about what neutrality could protect. And suddenly, the war was no longer something that happened somewhere else. It could happen anywhere. My name is James, and this is Echoes of the Great War, Episode 10. In this episode, we're leaving the trenches behind and moving into spaces that once felt untouched by the conflict shipping lanes, ports, neutral capitals, and open water. We're going to look at how naval warfare reshaped the war, not through massive fleet battles, but through pressure, uncertainty, and fear. We'll explore how submarines and blockades turned oceans into weapons, why civilians became targets without ever seeing an enemy, and how neutral nations found themselves pulled into the conflict without firing a single shot. This is the story of a war that no longer needed a front line, and of how neutrality, once a shield, became increasingly fragile until it barely existed at all. By the middle years of the war, it had become clear that victory would not come quickly on land. Trenches locked armies in place, artillery devoured manpower without delivering decisions, and offensives that promised breakthroughs dissolved into attrition. At sea, however, the situation looked different. The oceans still offered movement, they still offered leverage, and increasingly, they offered a way to attack an enemy without ever facing their army. Germany entered the war at a severe naval disadvantage. The British Royal Navy was the most powerful fleet in the world, larger and more experienced than anything Germany could field on the surface. A direct confrontation between battleships would almost certainly end in disaster. German planners understood this from the start, and that understanding shaped everything that followed. Unable to challenge Britain ship for ship, Germany turned to a weapon that did not require parity: the submarine. The U-boat, short for undersea boot, was not new, but this war gave it a new role. Submarines could slip past blockades, strike without warning, and disappear before retaliation was possible. They did not need to defeat the British fleet. They only needed to make the seas dangerous enough that trade itself became risky. Submarine warfare worked on a simple, brutal logic. A U-boat commander operated with limited visibility, often relying on brief periscope glimpses or intelligence reports. Once a target was identified, the window for action was short. Submarines were vulnerable on the surface and slow underwater. Surprise was not just an advantage, it was survival. This reality collided almost immediately with international law. Traditional naval warfare followed prize rules, which required warships to stop merchant vessels, inspect them, and ensure crews could abandon ship before destruction. That process assumed surface ships, time, and control. Submarines had none of those luxuries. Surfacing near a merchant ship made a U-boat vulnerable. Warning a target risked being rammed, fired upon, or radioing for help. As a result, German commanders faced a choice that was never clean: obey the rules and risk destruction, or abandon them and strike without warning. That choice carried moral weight as well as strategic consequence. Many of the ships crossing the Atlantic were civilian vessels carrying passengers, mail, and food alongside military cargo. Distinguishing between legitimate targets and neutral or civilian ships was often impossible from a periscope view. Flags could be misleading, manifests could be false, and once a torpedo was launched, there was no undoing the decision. Germany justified submarine warfare as a response to British actions. Because Britain controlled the seas, it had imposed a vast surface blockade on Germany, sealing off ports and inspecting shipping across wide stretches of ocean. This blockade was legal under British interpretation of international law, but devastating in its effects. Britain's blockade was slow, methodical, and relentless. By controlling sea lanes and restricting what goods could reach German ports, Britain aimed to starve the German war effort of raw materials, fuel, and eventually food. Ships carrying grain, fertilizer, and medical supplies were delayed, diverted, or denied entry altogether. Inside Germany, the impact was not immediate, but it was cumulative. As months passed, shortages worsened, food substitutes replaced staples, bread was stretched with fillers, meat became rare. By the later years of the war, malnutrition was widespread, particularly among children and the elderly. This was not accidental. British planners understood exactly what they were doing. The blockade was economic warfare, designed to weaken Germany from the inside out. It targeted factories and railways indirectly by targeting the civilian population that sustained them. Unlike a battle, it offered no moment of decision, no surrender ceremony, no clear endpoint. The civilian costs of the blockade became a political issue inside Germany. Public morale suffered, discontent grew. And while the blockade did not cause immediate collapse, it steadily eroded the resilience of German society. From Germany's perspective, submarine warfare was the only viable response. If Britain could starve Germany slowly, Germany would attempt to starve Britain quickly by sinking the ships that brought food, fuel, and troops across the Atlantic. The sea became a battlefield of logistics rather than fleets, where success was measured not in ships destroyed, but in tons sunk and routes abandoned. What made this kind of warfare especially destabilizing was its invisibility. A battle at sea might last hours. A submarine attack took seconds. There was no warning shot, no chance to flee. One moment a ship was moving calmly through open water. The next, it was flooding, tilting, and sinking. For civilians, this shattered the psychological boundary between combatant and non-combatant. A passenger buying a ticket on a liner could no longer assume safety based on neutrality or distance. A sailor on a merchant ship became a target not because of what he carried, but because of what his cargo represented. Both strategies, submarine warfare and blockade, were aimed at pressure rather than victory in the traditional sense. They were designed to wear down an enemy's ability to continue, not to defeat their armies directly. They made civilians participants in the war, whether they wanted to be or not. And that is what truly changed the nature of conflict at sea. Killing moved away from the battlefield and into the supply chain. Death came not only from shells and bullets, but from hunger, exposure, and drowning. Decisions made in naval offices and cabinet rooms reached into kitchens, ports, and passenger cabins thousands of miles away. The war had found a way to be everywhere at once. On paper, the Lusitania was not a weapon. She was a luxury ocean liner, one of the fastest and most prestigious ships afloat, operated by the Cunard Line and designed to carry passengers between Europe and North America in comfort and style. Her decks were wide, her dining rooms elegant, her reputation impeccable. To the traveling public, she represented the very idea of civilian safety at sea. On the morning of the 7th of May, 1915, the Lusitania approached the southern coast of Ireland, nearing the end of a routine crossing from New York to Liverpool. On board were nearly 2,000 people: businessmen, artists, families, children. Many were citizens of neutral countries, including the United States. They had every reason to believe they were safe. And yet, weeks earlier, the German government had issued a warning. Printed in newspapers in New York, adjacent to advertisements for the Lusitania's own departure, the notice cautioned that ships flying the British flag were liable to destruction in the waters around the British Isles. It was blunt, formal, and unmistakable. Germany argued that Britain's blockade had turned the seas into a combat zone, and that ships entering those waters did so at their own risk. Most passengers dismissed the warning. Some never saw it. Others assumed it was propaganda, or that no civilized nation would sink a civilian liner without warning. The Lusitania was fast. She was famous. She was, many believed, untouchable. Below the surface of the Atlantic, a German submarine waited. The U-boat U-20 had been operating in the waters off Ireland, targeting British shipping. Its commander, Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, was experienced and under orders to attack enemy vessels. Through his periscope, Schwieger spotted the Lusitania approaching, her silhouette unmistakable even at distance. What Schwieger knew, and what remains debated to this day, was what the Lusitania carried. In addition to passengers, she was transporting rifle cartridges and other munitions legally declared but not widely publicized. Under German interpretation, this made her a legitimate military target. Under Allied interpretation, the presence of civilians rendered her immune. Schwieger had minutes to decide. At approximately 2:14 in the afternoon, he ordered a single torpedo fired. It struck the Lusitania on her starboard side. Almost immediately, a second explosion followed its cause, still debated, magnifying the damage. Water flooded the ship at an alarming rate. The liner began to list heavily. Lifeboats became nearly impossible to launch. Passengers scrambled across tilting decks, some slipping into the sea, others trapped below. Within 18 minutes, the Lusitania was gone. Nearly 1,200 people died, including more than 100 Americans. Entire families vanished in moments. Survivors were left clinging to wreckage in cold water, watching the ship disappear beneath the surface. The speed of the sinking shocked even experienced sailors. There had been no time for an orderly evacuation, no chance to separate civilian life from military calculation. The distinction between passenger and combatant dissolved in less than half an hour. The international reaction was immediate and explosive. In Britain and France, the sinking was framed as an atrocity, proof that Germany had abandoned all restraint. Newspapers printed images of drowned children, politicians spoke of barbarism. The Lusitania became a symbol, not just of loss, but of moral clarity, an innocent victim of an enemy without limits. In the United States, still officially neutral, outrage spread rapidly. Editorials demanded accountability. Public opinion hardened. President Woodrow Wilson faced intense pressure to respond, even as he sought to keep the country out of the war. Germany's response was defensive and legalistic. Officials argued that Britain had deliberately endangered civilians by using passenger ships to transport war materials, and that the blockade itself violated international norms. If Britain could starve German civilians through economic warfare, Germany argued, then Britain could not expect immunity for ships supporting that effort. Two narratives emerged, each internally coherent and utterly incompatible. To the Allies, the Lusitania proved that submarine warfare was inherently criminal. To Germany, it proved that modern war had erased the boundary between civilian and military logistics. What made the incident so destabilizing was not just the loss of life, but the collapse of shared assumptions. The ocean had once been governed by visibility and procedure. Ships were stopped, flags were checked, crews were given time. Submarines made that world obsolete. Technology had compressed decision-making into seconds and hidden violence beneath the surface. A commander no longer faced an enemy ship across open water. He faced a shape, a speed, and a calculation viewed through a lens. Once the torpedo was launched, there was no warning to give and no mercy to extend. Neutrality, too, lost its protective power. The Lusitania was a civilian ship carrying neutral passengers, traveling a civilian route, and none of that mattered once she entered a declared war zone. Safety was no longer defined by law or intention, but by proximity and risk. The sinking did not immediately bring the United States into the war, but it changed the tone irrevocably. Germany temporarily curtailed unrestricted submarine warfare under diplomatic pressure, aware that American entry would be catastrophic. But the logic of naval war remained unchanged. Britain continued its blockade. Germany continued to search for ways to break it. The Lusitania lingered in public memory, not as a tactical event, but as a warning. It showed that the war could reach anyone, that civilians were no longer shielded by distance, and that technology had outrun the moral frameworks designed to contain it. At sea, the old rules still existed on paper, but the war was no longer being fought on paper. For countries that declared themselves neutral, the war did not arrive with artillery or mobilization orders. It arrived more quietly, through trade agreements, shipping insurance rates, diplomatic cables, and the slow realization that staying out of the war did not mean escaping it. Neutrality, in theory, was a legal status. In practice, it became a daily negotiation. Nations like the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Spain, and the United States, before its entry into the war, found themselves caught between two forms of pressure that were difficult to resist and impossible to ignore. On one side stood the British blockade, controlling access to global shipping lanes. On the other stood German submarines, making those same lanes increasingly dangerous. Every commercial decision became political. Who could trade with whom mattered. What goods were allowed mattered even more. Coal, grain, oil, rubber, metals, all of them could be classified as civilian necessities or military supplies, depending on context. Britain pushed aggressively to expand the definition of contraband, arguing that anything sustaining an enemy economy ultimately sustained its war effort. Neutral ships were stopped and searched. Cargoes were delayed or confiscated. Entire shipments were rerouted to British ports for inspection. The legal justification was contested, but Britain's naval dominance made resistance impractical. For neutral governments, this created a dilemma: comply too readily and risk angering Germany, which viewed cooperation with the blockade as a hostile act. Resist too strongly and risk economic isolation, shortages, or outright confrontation with Britain. Germany applied its own pressure in response. Submarine commanders were instructed to treat ships suspected of supplying the Allies as legitimate targets, regardless of their flag. Neutral markings offered no guarantee of safety. In some cases, they offered none at all. The result was a shrinking space in which neutrality could exist. Economic dependency intensified the problem. Many neutral countries relied heavily on international trade to sustain their populations. Food imports, fuel supplies, and raw materials flowed across borders that war now distorted. Banking systems were interconnected. Insurance markets spanned continents. Shipping companies operated globally. A disruption in one place echoed elsewhere. For example, a neutral country importing grain from overseas might find its shipments delayed by British inspections, then endangered by German submarines once released. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. Shipping costs rose. Prices climbed at home. Scarcity bred public frustration. Governments were forced to intervene. rationing goods, or negotiating special arrangements, often under conditions dictated by the warring powers rather than by neutral preference. Diplomacy became an exercise in calibration. Neutral leaders worked constantly to avoid provocation while maintaining the appearance of sovereignty. Public statements were measured. Protests were issued quietly. Concessions were framed as technical rather than political. Behind closed doors, officials bargained for exemptions, shipping corridors, and guarantees that could be revoked at any time. This balancing act was exhausting, and it was never fully successful. Public opinion added another layer of strain. Citizens did not experience neutrality as an abstract principle. They experienced it as shortages, higher prices, and fear. When neutral ships were sunk and sailors killed, anger flared. When trade slowed and food disappeared, patience wore thin. Newspapers debated responsibility. Was Britain abusing its power? Was Germany committing crimes? Should neutrality be defended at all costs? Or was it becoming a liability? Governments often found themselves out of step with their populations. Leaders prioritized long-term stability and diplomatic caution. Citizens demanded immediate protection and moral clarity. This tension mattered because neutrality required public cooperation. Without it, governments risked internal unrest even as they tried to avoid external conflict. What made the situation especially unstable was that neutrality no longer guaranteed predictability. Traditional international law assumed clear distinctions: combatants and non-combatants, belligerents and neutrals, war zones and safe passages. Naval warfare collapsed those distinctions. Economic warfare blurred legal lines. A neutral ship carrying food could be feeding civilians or sustaining a factory. A bank extending credit could be facilitating trade or financing war production. The difference was often semantic, and power determined which interpretation prevailed. Neutrality became conditional. It depended on compliance, restraint, and constant negotiation. It could be revoked by a single incident, a single sinking, or a single diplomatic miscalculation. For the United States, neutrality became increasingly untenable. American businesses traded heavily with the Allies, drawing German ire. American citizens traveled on civilian ships, drawing public concern. Each incident tested the boundary between economic engagement and political involvement. Other neutral states faced similar pressures with fewer resources. Smaller nations lacked leverage. Their choices were constrained by geography and dependency. Some drifted closer to one side or the other, not by ideological alignment, but by necessity. This was not how neutrality had been imagined. It was no longer a shield. It was a position to be defended constantly, and one that grew more fragile as the war dragged on. The broader implication was profound. If neutral states could not remain truly neutral in a global war, then the war itself could not remain limited. Economic networks ensured that conflict radiated outward, touching countries that never mobilized an army. War had found a way to travel through contracts, cargo holds, and bank ledgers. And once neutrality became negotiable, escalation became easier. Each concession set a precedent. Each violation eroded restraint. Each sinking hardened attitudes. By the time governments admitted that neutrality was failing, their options were already narrowing. They had not chosen the war, but the war was choosing them. Neutrality did not collapse all at once. It eroded quietly, in meetings that never made headlines, in memoranda marked confidential, in cabinet rooms where every option seemed to carry risk and none offered safety. Consider a small neutral state in Northern Europe in the middle years of the war. Its ports are busy, its banks are solvent, its people are fed barely. Officially, it is not at war. Unofficially, it is surrounded by it. Inside the cabinet room, the agenda is familiar: trade, security, public order, survival. The first problem is economic. The country depends on imports for food, fuel, and raw materials. Its ships carry goods across contested waters. Its merchants have contracts with both sides. Its banks extend credit that keeps industries running. If trade collapses, unemployment follows. If unemployment follows, unrest is not far behind. And yet, every shipment is political. British officials insist that certain goods must not reach Germany. They demand guarantees, certificates, inspections. They warn politely, at first, that continued trade could be interpreted as hostile. German diplomats deliver their own messages. They speak of sovereignty, of rights under international law, of consequences if neutral shipping supports the enemy. They point to recent sinkings. They do not need to elaborate. The cabinet debates. Should the country comply with British demands, knowing that doing so risks German retaliation at sea? Or should it assert its neutral rights and allow trade to continue, knowing that British naval power can choke commerce almost at will? Neither option preserves neutrality. One aligns the country economically with the Allies. The other risks isolation and violence. Security complicates matters further. Neutrality does not mean safety. Ships are sunk. Sailors are killed. Insurance rates soar. Families read reports of vessels lost without warning. The public begins to ask uncomfortable questions. Why are we trading at all? Why are our ships being targeted? What is neutrality worth if it cannot protect lives? The government's responsibility is to protect its citizens, but protection now seems to require choosing which risks are acceptable. The cabinet hears from military advisors who caution against provoking either side. They speak of preparedness without mobilization, of quiet readiness. They urge restraint. Business leaders argue the opposite. Trade, they insist, is the lifeblood of the nation. Without it, the economy will collapse. Concessions can be managed, losses absorbed, but total disruption would be catastrophic. Labor representatives raise a different concern. Workers face rising prices and shortages. They fear rationing, unemployment, and unrest. They want stability, but they also want fairness. Why, they ask, should ordinary people bear the cost of decisions made in distant capitals? Public opinion fractures. Newspapers take sides. Editorials accuse the government of weakness or recklessness. Some argue that neutrality is a moral failure in the face of atrocities. Others insist that staying out of the war is the only responsible course. The cabinet feels the pressure from all directions. Every decision is provisional. Every concession invites another demand. And the space for neutrality grows narrower by the week. External pressure intensifies. The British expand their definition of contraband, tightening inspections and delaying shipments. German submarines operate closer to neutral coasts. Each incident becomes a test. When a neutral ship is stopped, searched, or sunk, the government must respond, but responses are constrained. Strong protests risk escalation. Weak protests invite repetition. Diplomatic language becomes increasingly strained, balancing outrage with restraint. Behind the scenes, officials negotiate quietly. Special agreements are reached. Guarantees are offered. Quotas are imposed. Trade is rerouted. Neutrality is preserved on paper through compromise. But compromise has a cost. Each accommodation shifts the country's position slightly. Each exception becomes precedent. Over time, neutrality stops being a principle and becomes a posture, something maintained through constant adjustment rather than firm boundaries. The cabinet begins to realize that neutrality now depends on the goodwill of the warring powers. And goodwill is in short supply. The most dangerous moment comes when officials recognize that there may be no neutral choice left. If they comply with Allied demands, Germany may respond with force. If they resist, Britain may impose economic penalties that cripple the country. If they attempt to split the difference, both sides may lose patience. Neutrality has become unsustainable, not because the government abandoned it, but because the war no longer accommodates it. This realization is not dramatic. There is no declaration, no sudden shift, just a slow acknowledgement that the old rules no longer apply. The cabinet adjourns late, decisions are postponed, statements are drafted and revised. Ministers go home knowing that whatever choice they make next will anger someone and may cost lives. Neutrality, once a stable position, has become an exercise in damage control. The key insight is this: neutrality in a global war required constant compromise, and compromise itself became corrosive. Each concession weakened the very independence neutrality was meant to preserve. By the time governments understood this, their freedom of action was already constrained. They had not chosen sides. But the war had made choice unavoidable. And when neutrality finally failed, as it did for several states, it did not fail because of ideology or ambition. It failed because the structures of modern war left no room for standing still. Naval warfare during World War I did not become unrestricted overnight. It drifted there. Not because leaders abandoned restraint all at once, but because every attempt to limit the war at sea ran headlong into the same problem. Pressure without resolution created incentives to escalate. At its core, escalation followed a familiar logic. Retaliation invited counter-retaliation. Pressure demanded more pressure, and deterrence failed because neither side believed the other would stop first. Britain's blockade was comprehensive and unapologetic. It aimed to weaken Germany economically, to shorten the war by exhausting the enemy's capacity to fight. From London's perspective, the blockade was legal, effective, and necessary. It was also slow. Its results accumulated over months and years, not days. Germany's response, submarine warfare, offered speed. A single torpedo could destroy a ship in minutes. Losses were immediate. Psychological impact was profound. But early in the war, Germany hesitated to use submarines without restriction, aware that civilian casualties and neutral outrage could provoke disastrous consequences. This hesitation did not last. Every month, the blockade tightened. Food shortages worsened. Public morale frayed. German leaders faced pressure of their own, not just to win the war, but to demonstrate that they were responding to civilian suffering at home. Unrestricted submarine warfare promised a solution. If submarines could sink enough shipping quickly enough, Britain might be forced to negotiate. Supply lines could be severed. The war could be shortened. On paper, the logic was compelling. German leaders did not ignore the risks. They understood that neutral nations, especially the United States, might be drawn into the conflict. They debated timelines, probabilities, and thresholds. Some warned that escalation would backfire. Others argued that the status quo was already intolerable. In the end, pressure won. The return to unrestricted submarine warfare was a calculated gamble, one taken with eyes open. German leadership accepted the possibility of neutral entry into the war in exchange for the chance to break the blockade and force a decision. At sea, restraint collapsed. Submarine commanders were no longer expected to warn ships or verify cargo. Suspicion became sufficient. Neutral flags lost meaning. Shipping lanes became kill zones defined by proximity rather than legality. For neutral governments, patience snapped. Diplomatic protests hardened. Language sharpened. Incidents that might once have been absorbed now provoked public outrage and political consequences. Each sinking reinforced the sense that neutrality was no longer respected or viable. The naval war fed directly into political escalation. Every torpedo that struck a civilian ship became a diplomatic event. Every blockade delay became a grievance. Naval decisions reverberated through foreign ministries, newspapers, and parliaments. The sea, once imagined as a buffer between nations, became a conduit for escalation. What made this especially dangerous was that naval warfare operated on compressed timelines. A submarine commander made decisions in seconds, but those decisions carried strategic consequences that unfolded over months. Political leaders reacted after the fact, often too late to reverse course. By the time escalation was acknowledged, it had already reshaped the war. The targeting of civilians, whether through starvation or sudden sinking, accelerated everything. It stripped away ambiguity. It hardened public opinion. It narrowed diplomatic options. Once civilians became targets, escalation no longer required intent. It required only continuation. Each side told itself it was responding, not provoking. Each believed the other would yield first. Neither did. The war at sea thus followed the same tragic pattern as the war on land, a series of rational decisions made under pressure, producing outcomes no one fully controlled. By the end of this phase, restraint had not failed because it was abandoned. It failed because the war no longer rewarded it. And with escalation at sea now normalized, the stage was set for consequences that would reach far beyond the oceans themselves. In this episode, we followed the war away from the trenches and onto the oceans, and in doing so, we saw how the conflict became both invisible and omnipresent. At sea, there were no front lines to cross and no warning shots to hear. Submarines and blockades turned distance into danger and trade into a battlefield. Decisions made far from the fighting in naval offices, shipping firms, and cabinet rooms now carried lethal consequences for civilians who would never see an enemy. We saw how Britain's blockade targeted an entire society through economic pressure, while Germany's submarines responded with sudden, decisive violence. Both strategies aimed to break endurance rather than defeat armies, and both pushed the war deeper into civilian life. Neutrality, once imagined as a stable refuge, eroded under that pressure. Neutral governments found themselves navigating impossible choices, balancing trade against security, sovereignty against survival. Each concession narrowed their freedom of action until neutrality itself became a temporary condition rather than a lasting status. What connected all of this was escalation without clarity. The naval war did not expand because leaders sought greater destruction, but because limited measures failed to deliver results. Retaliation bred countermeasures. Pressure demanded escalation. Restraint became a liability rather than a virtue. By the time unrestricted submarine warfare returned, the lines between combatant and civilian, belligerent and neutral, had largely collapsed. And that collapse mattered. Because escalation at sea did not stay at sea. It reshaped public opinion, hardened diplomatic positions, and set the stage for new entrants into the war, most notably the United States. It also intensified strains inside the great powers themselves, feeding unrest, exhaustion, and doubt. In the next episode, we move into the year that breaks the war open. 1917 brings revolution, collapse, and transformation. Empires fall apart, new powers step in, and the assumptions that have carried the war this far finally begin to crack. That's next time on Echoes of the Great War.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, we recommend reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark and The First World War by Hugh Strachan. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment and share us with others. And to be the first to know when new episodes and seasons are released, you can follow the show on your preferred podcast platform and on social media by searching for Echoes of War Pod.